We have two MEF board members. Thank you for joining. And work away.
Yeah, I need control. First of all, let me bring on Nick. Obviously, you've seen Nick both yesterday and today, and as ever, he provides a very good grounding, a very good start point for us all to start talking on any of the subjects around our space, to actually base it on numbers, on reality. And also, Jason will be joining us. I think most of you know Jason. Again, really, in this particular subject, we've got to get some reality into these things. It's great talking about the theory and the statistics, and from our perspective, from XConnect's perspective, kind of some of the things we can do to help. But do they work? So I think that's a lot of what we'll ask Jason to comment about. Now, kind of to repeat a little there, this whole thing of artificial traffic inflation has come up numerous times, and I was kind of going through yesterday and this morning, sort of making a note every time somebody mentioned it. And it is clearly on the top of the agenda. You know, right at the beginning, as Juniper talked about their research, they were really identifying grey routes and artificial traffic inflation as the two points that they observed, that they kind of made an issue of, that we've all got to be paying attention to. I think we'd got Lank and AB Handshake. They introduced that in a very interesting way. They were saying, one of the things that you might want to look at is what's going into your network, what's coming out. If you can actually compare excuse my English here, but your gazintas and your gazouters, if you can compare, then you have an opportunity to find out, did everything go through my network? Has it been inflated? Has it been lost? What are the characteristics of that traffic going through? We also had Carlos, I think, from PCCW. He was talking a little about that and some of the mechanisms that could be put in place to protect. And then Nick, this morning, that was clearly a key point when we start to look at the statistics and his Pantone of risk factors, which I just loved that. When I heard that in Mobile World Congress, us beginning to describe these things as kind of a Pantone, I thought that was the perfect way of thinking about it, because the shades of grey just don't work anymore. I think Alex, earlier on, I was thinking, wow, he's going to cover all of my subject, because when Open Mind were talking about the importance and kind of some of the drivers, I think he gave the most superb example of why this is now coming up top of or certainly in the top 2 lists of threats to our industry. When somebody like Twitter turns around and says, we are not going to use two-factor authentication because it has cost us too much money and we don't know what we're getting back in return for it. I'm not sure he gave any real explanation other than we're just not going to do it anymore. But I think we can all read between the lines that there is someone whose alarm bells have gone off on a very big scale. I think we've got another piece which is probably not quite so public, but I'm sure the rumour machine amongst our industry works extremely well in telling us that we've got some very, very large big tech who have chosen not to pay their bills to their aggregators, in that they don't believe that they're actually getting the value for money that they're being charged. So there's a huge, great big, well, what shall I call this, an exclamation mark or an alarm bell. Although statistically we might be saying, well, it's a very small part, it's just a few percentage points. When you turn that into the billions of dollars we're talking about and the trillions of messages we're talking about, all of a sudden it becomes properly significant. So I think, I don't really kind of have to persuade anyone here. I think that we've got to have that subject. So what I was really hoping to do was kind of just get into a little more detail and a little more depth. I'll do one thing, if I may, which is just to give you a little bit of background if you're not familiar with XConnect and kind of why we're here and kind of why we're interested in this. We're a pure data company. We're not part of the message flow at all. We simply maintain a number of data sets. I'll describe them in that way. And although there's a lot more than this in reality, there's 3 primary data sets that we manage and provide to the industry. The first is around just basic global number plans. Who owns a number? Who's responsible for that number? More to the point, where a number's not owned, where they're unknown, or they might be part of a number plan which is forbidden. They are effectively unallocated numbers for some particular range. That particular data set is absolutely key to this particular subject, incidentally, in just knowing enough about a number to know whether it's real. The second major data set, which is really where our business came from, is in providing routing information based on number portability. So we're collecting data from really all of the number portability authorities around the world and creating a global data set that can be used to identify right now where a number is corrected for portability. And then the third data set is really collecting data from the MNOs themselves, from mobile operators, and providing access to their data sets and being able to say, so is this number actually registered on a network? Is it actually reachable or active right now? Where that's possible. In many places that's not possible, by the way. But if you sort of look at those three data sets, another way of looking at it is almost the first one is data that's got a kind of about a month, maybe a week lifetime. It's data which is supposed to be relatively static, but in reality it does change a lot. I mean, we see about between 20 and 80,000 changes a month in terms of basic number plan information. The second set, number portability, is what's live right now this minute. Where is this number? Where has it gone? Now, I say right now this minute, number portability is usually run on about a daily basis. So you're looking at data that has about a day's validity. And then I think the third set really is right now this minute. I need to know, at this moment, can I reach this number? How do I do so? So I'm sure you can begin to see that the reason why I kind of come up and talk about artificial traffic inflation or some of those techniques is that a lot can be done by using what I consider to be sort of authoritative information about numbers. Is it a good number? Is it actually owned by someone? Who is it owned by? Is it actually reachable? Should it be deliverable right now? And I'll hopefully put that into a little more context later. To come back to kind of the subject in mind, first thing I thought I should do is actually for some of you who may either be newer members of the MEF or sort of not familiar with this space, I think, Jason, I'm trying to think when it was. It would be, what, 2 years ago, maybe 3 years ago?
The initial version of the fraud framework came in 2016.
Do you want to come and join me?
Sorry, yes.
Please, why don't you both come in and we can expand this a little more. Yes, so so this has been around a little time, and you know, it's a document I would strongly advise anybody working in this area uses, because I think one of the things it really does is define a vocabulary so that we can all describe something and use the same terms to describe it. So we're actually all talking about the same thing. And you know, I think it's been mentioned a few times that there's sort of been, I think, 14 identified fraud classifications. Now, we all know there's an awful lot more than that when you start diving into it and getting a little more granular about it. But let's say some broad classifications. So there's probably two in here. One, well, actually, let me start off with one is just defining a model very quickly in terms of kind of the elements that are involved in this ecosystem. And this diagram is used throughout that document to explain the key components in what we're all describing as an ecosystem. You'll see in a moment, I'll try and simplify that down to just a straight line rather more than this sort of mesh diagram. And it's also looking at how fraud really is mapping into different classes or different parts of the ecosystem. Is it affecting the consumer? Is it affecting the business? Is it affecting the messaging provider? Is it affecting the MNO? I think there is an overall point which I thought came out beautifully earlier on, which is almost the obligation to look at this as an industry and say, are these things damaging trust in the messaging ecosystem, in the messaging as a channel? And to be honest, when I think about that, that is probably the biggest issue. That's what we're all worrying about. Does the enterprise trust us? Does the subscriber trust SMS? And we have a job to maintain that, irrespective of what's in between. But I think, as you're looking at that again, this document did a very good job of defining a framework that we could put things into.
I'd add, sorry, Tim,
Please.
This fraud framework is on the MEF site. Please go and grab it if you haven't got a copy of it and use it. My team tend to use it as a bit of a Bible, really, is the way we would look at it. It's something to reference. As you said, the terms in there are quite consistent. It is now in its third version. I'm sure we'll get to a fourth version at some point as we continue to enhance this document. The latest version 3, I'm looking for James, I think it was 18 months ago or something, it came out, something like that, which included AIT, it includes mitigations. I know we did quite a lot of work on that document, didn't we, to get it to the position it is today.
Sorry, I forgot to include you in that conversation. I should have done.
But I think for everyone, please go and grab a copy and use it. And if there are inputs to it, make sure you get on the working group and continue to enhance that document for everyone's benefit. So we just want to be consistent around how we talk about fraud.
So I think the other challenge we've got in here is we've got some real experts here. I was feeling rather nervous coming up to talk about this subject because there's much more knowledgeable people in this group than I will ever be on the subject. But at least what I really wanted to do was lead through a number of items. And as we said, within this document, we've kind of got two types of fraud which I think directly apply to this subject. One is around message trashing, and I've always felt that's a great term, but it's really where someone is either accepting or creating or ghosting or whatever else, but a message is simply being dropped so that you don't have to pay for terminating that message. It's almost as simple as that. It's a very, very straightforward process. Someone somewhere is creating that message, and they may be faking a delivery piece of information for it, because who can prove whether a marketing message actually got delivered or not? It's a bit like saying, all right, how many people clicked on this web page? Can you prove it? Well, you can count.
I think there are certain things you can do to try and identify if your supplier is doing this, certain practices that you can implement to try and understand. I think generally if the price is too good to be true, it's too good to be true for a reason. And so this is one of the techniques that are being used to reduce that price.
But it in a way, I always find these things are just extraordinary. Are you telling me that you've given me something to deliver and you just threw it away so that you didn't have to pay the final delivery charge? Now, I'm afraid that just seems outrageous to me, but there are definitely broad examples of where this happens. One thing that I might get onto, though, is where some of this traffic actually starts from and where it can happen by accident. Because I think there are malicious situations where it happens, but there are also just simply environments where it can happen for other simple dotting the I's and crossing the T's reasons. So let's come back onto that. I don't know, Nick, from your point of view, when you look at the statistics and the numbers, this whole thing of throwing away messages is probably less of what you see, rather more people adding messages somewhere. Is this something that you can detect when you're doing your research?
Well, we've got to adapt our methodology, basically, because to avoid, when we started looking at the numbers doing our forecast about 8-9 years ago, we were trying to overcome the double counting. Because obviously, we'd get figures in from an operator, we'd get it from an aggregator, and you kind of think, well, hang on a minute. So the way that we kind of initially overcome that was to look at what was the KPI for us was number of messages delivered per unique mobile user in each market. So if you could see that figure was, in some markets it could be 20, in others it could be 1 or 2 per month, for example. So that was kind of when we worked our way back with the numbers and looked at it that way. But obviously now we've got to kind of look at message or kind of origination as well now to start looking at what is not getting through. So there's a couple of areas that in our numbers we have probably missed. So one would be trashing, which we're obviously trying to kind of address now, but also kind of the messages that, like you're saying, that are kind of not delivered for, it could be some basic error, in terms of the wrong usage.
I'll come on to that in a moment because I think
It's
that's
blocked
something
by a
really worth
firewall,
exploring. So we'll dive into that particular point in just a moment. I think the second case, which is in the document, I think this is where we really are using that phrase, AIT, artificial inflation of traffic. I think the use case that is shown in here is clearly one of those, and I think possibly over the last couple of years, what has happened here is this use case has evolved and it's developed a whole set of additional flavours. And maybe that's where we do need to provide some kind of update in the document to recognise that there's more to this than necessarily meets the eye. I think the use case that was originally shown has happened, does happen, and we've certainly seen examples of it. But just to try and talk through a little of what is happening here, we've got somebody generating a message to a destination in the hope of getting a message back. Whether that return message is an automated process or whether that return message is just manual, almost like, I think you've probably heard within the voice world, the Wangiri fraud. You give someone a call and you hope they're going to call you back because they saw your caller ID. You've put in a caller ID that might be a premium rate number or something of that sort. It's a very good way of generating lots of revenue on premium rate numbers and is very, very, very much present in our networks today. This is almost the messaging equivalent of that environment. But I think there was a very specific business case that was identified when this was put together, which was where the origination cost was less than the termination cost or the termination payback. So you're looking at a balance of payments as a means of extracting some money. But I think what we've got to think about here is, so are there other cases where this real artificial inflation of traffic actually has got different business drivers or maybe a different business model? I think it's also looking at, are there different places within the supply chain or within the transmission chain where this is actually taking place? I don't know, again, if you want to kind of expand on any sort of additional experiences you've had in this space.
Yeah, it does exist. Identifying it can be challenging. It is possible though, and so I agree. I think there could be some variation to this document to help improve how we talk about it, for sure. I think, going back to, everyone goes back to the Elon position. I know Alex and the team mentioned it on the previous session as well. That for me, those kind of things come out, and actually, I think what everyone forgets, I think it was yourself, Eileen, who may have mentioned it in the session a little while ago. This is everyone has an obligation here to do something. This isn't just about the operator that Elon was talking about. It's the operators doing this. It's about everyone here. It's all of us. Everyone in the ecosystem has an obligation to try and resolve this, and that can be challenging, because there is a revenue line here, but we've got to do the right thing to make sure we retain trust. Or build trust in some circumstances to ensure that the ecosystem continues to grow for all of our benefits.
So let me try and kind of dive down a little deeper into this and maybe look at some of the more specific cases. But I thought before I did that, I'd just kind of give an example. This is real customer data. Obviously, I can't mention the customer name, but what they've put in place is a means of saying, so for every time someone requests a callback for any reason, and they actually combine voice and messaging in here, they don't separate the two out, because generally when there's some kind of callback, they'll do both. They may make a voice call or they may send a message. There's also the situation where they're being asked to send back a one-time code. So they're checking out every single number that is given to them on their website to say, I would like a transaction to be addressed to this particular number, and they're checking every single one out. Now, as you can see, that really across the bottom here, we've got the dates. So that's going back to roughly this time last year when they started doing this. The most scary thing, there's roughly 100 million transactions a month that this particular customer was checking out, and that's pretty consistent across the time span. As you see at the beginning, they just kind of got started, and they were seeing about 8 million totally invalid. Now, we don't know whether they're fraudulent. We don't know whether they're just badly typed in. We don't know whether it's because someone forgot to put the right format of data in there. But their website is designed already to check that the data complies with the normal telephone format. So they're already using quite a smart bit of code just to ensure that data entry is correct. But even then, what they're finding is when they check that against, and you remember that data set I talked about earlier on, the global number plan, GNR global number range data set, they're checking against that global number range data set, and they're finding 8 million out of 100 million, so 8%, the maths is not difficult, were simply invalid and unrecognisable. That number then actually increased over a period of time because I think they were seeing a great growth in this kind of problem. I found it fascinating that, it is countries like the UK, numbers within the UK number range were being used and just they were invalid, incorrect. Now, one way of looking at this is a really simple one, which is if it's not a dialable number and it's not a messageable number and you're going to generate a message to it and it just falls on the floor because it's not going to get delivered, all right, that was 8% of your costs have suddenly been taken out of the equation because you will get charged for those calls even if they don't get delivered, or those messages in particular. You'll get charged for those. So don't send them. If it's rubbish, don't send it. And it astonishes me how much of this traffic basically ticks the rubbish box, or should tick the rubbish box. You can see some things which were clearly very, very strange when you think, how on earth could Monaco or Jordan be creating over 1 million calls in a month? All right, you could have detected that with AI and said, that's weird, that's just not right. But I can also detect it with the simplest test on the planet. Does this number exist? So it's, there are some simple ways of doing things, there are some complex ways of doing things. And I would say you probably want to use both those techniques. But I just give that as an example where there's 2 countries in there that you really would never expect to see that amount of traffic from, and clearly that's good old-fashioned fraudulent traffic. You also see some big lumps. There's a lump there in last month. For some reason, in March, a whole additional set of invalid traffic was generated with UK numbers on it. No idea why, no idea what. I'll take one other thing from this, which is that there's a trend on that curve. It did start really bad, and the fraudsters learnt. And they learnt not to use invalid numbers. So you can see the general trend came down. But I've still got 1 million. I've still got over 1% of my 100 million, which are simply bad traffic. I've still got the UK doing something really weird for a month, which popped up out of nowhere. So I think when I look at that in terms of, we know that the fraudsters will learn. We know that they are agile. They move from one country to another. Each of these colours is a different country, and you can see they're all growing and shifting, and that balance of that traffic is changing all the time. You can also see that they will continue doing some stupid things. Now, what this doesn't show is some other characteristics. So one of the things that this customer is using this data for is to track premium rate numbers. And I think that got mentioned earlier on as well. Very, very common that premium rate numbers are being used for callbacks to generate direct revenue to the endpoint. So maybe that's something, please.
I was going to say, I think it's really important that when you talk about this, the trend has gone down, which is great, and the fraudsters are, trying to do other things. They're trying to see if the rules have been removed and those kind of things, and trying to look again, And that's the important thing is when you put a rule in, making sure you don't remove it too quickly, because otherwise the fraudster will come back in 6 months and they'll have another go, and they'll go from there. I think the other thing is, for me, is about false positives. It could have been, let's pick something random. Last weekend in the UK was a big horse race called the Grand National. Okay, all the betting companies would have been sending millions of messages to their customers. Do you want to gamble on this? Do you want to go? And so there's lots of traffic that's generated out of those one-off events, and those can be legitimate. And so spotting what is fraudulent or what isn't fraudulent in live is a whole solution that, we've all got to evolve with and learn to make sure that we don't block traffic inadvertently, because that can lead to a bad experience. On a Saturday when the Grand National is taking place, the last thing you want is if your team aren't in the office and able to control the systems and it blocks all this gambling traffic. and the first you find out is when there's a P1 on your platform. And so, yeah, consider those kind of one-off scenarios quite
Yeah.
well.
I rather like what PowerPoint did to my Monaco there, because it's sort of like Monaco. But anyway, so my sense of humour gets me there.
I love how you blame PowerPoint.
I blame PowerPoint, of course, not my fault, not my fault at all. I think also, and you mentioned something there about taking away a rule. I can't quite persuade these guys to turn this off and see what happens. It's not in their interest. My statistical nature would love to know how long it takes that this type of fraud to actually build back up again. But anyway, that's a theoretical discussion. So, you know, really, as I said earlier on, one of the things that I kind of think of when I'm looking at this delivery chain is to look at it in a very, very simple, linear fashion. And my general model that I always think of goes right the way from the user back to a phone. So my user would be my user of a website. My application would be my web pages. A2P platform would probably be some of you guys providing those platforms as a service to them, and so on through the chain. And one of the biggest challenges, I think, with this AIT world is, where do I point the finger? It can happen at almost any point across that. And I think that's where we end up almost subdividing this particular subject into kind of these little subsets. You know, it could happen here, it could happen there, and that's a different one. But I think even then, I'm sort of really tried to separate out and look at a few of particular cases. So we talked earlier on, for instance, of generate and trash. And I see that as a specific case. Someone somewhere is generating traffic, and it could be at any point along that entire chain, and they're throwing it away so they don't have to pay the termination fees at the other end. And that's a very simple financial, it's a cost saving, it's can I get away with it? But we can all see it's a bad thing. It's something which the user or the company, the brand, the enterprise that is trying to use this service, they are the people hurt by it. They are the victims of this particular one. They're going to end up paying for something they don't get. And you kind of say, so how do they self-check? How do they know that they're actually getting what they should be getting?
Surely it also depends on the use case.
Has to depend on that.
Because if it's marketing promotions, are they going to care?
And it's an accepted practice that people don't read things, people don't see things.
Yeah, but I mean, you think one of the celebrated use case studies that, as an industry, we've been talking about for about 5 years, or not so much now, but go back 5 years, there's a celebrated pizza chain that would use effectively grey routes, shall we say, to send out messages. And, you know, the figure that, you know, about 70%, 75%, I think, were being delivered. But they weren't really that bothered by all accounts, because ultimately the 70% that were being delivered was generating a massive ROI in terms of pizza sales. So, you know, I think it also comes down to the use case. So in something like one-time passwords, if they're not delivered, then that is a problem. Or if they're delivered and you haven't requested it, that could be a problem as well.
So, Jason, I mean, what do you see in terms of things like delivery records? And I mean, I think a lot of people will be very familiar with this, but we kind of expect to get a delivery record from the MNO who is finally delivering the message. Is that usable? Is it useful? Is it relevant?
Absolutely. That information is relevant. It is useful for us. I think it helps identify potential issues. If there's latency in there, or if, depending on the latency, it could be too long, too quick, those kind of things. But yeah, I think with good quality data, you'd expect a high degree of deliverability directly to the operators. I think one of the critical things for me is make sure we understand that supply chain and we know that it's getting to the operator. If we don't have the direct connectivity ourselves, that we've got a trusted partner who is going direct to the operator. We don't want messages jumping around, adding latency, adding hops. It reduces or increases, depending on how we look at it, it increases the probability of someone else infringing and doing something bad into that process, into that delivery chain. And for us and our customers, we can't risk that. We have to make sure it gets there and it's of high quality deliverability. That's critical.
So it seems to come down to almost the quality of the aggregator or the hub, or you've got to have direct connect.
Yes.
Effectively. So you've either got to trust your supply chain, your upstream supply chain, or you've got to be able to do it yourself.
For us, yes, yeah. At the scale that we're operating at, that's the only way we can do that.
So the next one on the list was kind of the generate and monetize, and that's kind of the case we were talking about earlier on, where you might be monetizing through a premium rate number, but you can also monetize through a non-premium, just an ordinary number, because you might be looking at a cent or so delivery charges for each message. So there's good money to be had if you can generate traffic and you can somehow terminate it yourself or terminate it to a dummy destination. What has really surprised me is what I'd describe as ghost destinations. You know, we're seeing traffic that is being delivered to numbers that don't exist. So, you know, I can tell you whether I can pretty accurately tell you whether a number actually exists or not and it's reachable. And I then see statistics of traffic that is going through and somehow it's being terminated. And you can't really see where that's gone. So somewhere in this supply chain, someone is taking up some of that traffic and actually finding a way of terminating it and also charging back in some way to the place that it came from. So I think that's kind of another one of these that falls into the same category, but it's a kind of a worrying trend that it's even possible for that to happen. You know, one of the things that well, actually, no, I'll come on to that in a moment, but one of the things we're seeing is also this concept of global titles. You know, within the messaging world, a global title is telling you where to send a message, where it should be terminated. What happens if that global title has been leased or passed on to a third party or subleased to another third party? How valid is that information, and do you trust them? Do you know who they are? Do you know they're actually delivering traffic to real live numbers? So I think that's an interesting challenge around, it's almost knowing your supply chain, knowing where that traffic is going.
I'd say, Tim, there around that item, I think a lot of our experience this year really in that area has identified it's like tier 3 operators is where we're seeing it. So where numbers are leased by operators to tier 2s, then out to their tier 3s. Yeah, you know, you can pass the information back to the operators, and some of them are really passionate, come back really quickly. They've disconnected the tier 3, or their customer there has been removed, or that range has gone, those kind of things. Some of them are really passionate about moving that forwards. Others accept the information, but the traffic keeps flowing. So you can see the range is still active and operational, and the fraudsters are still using it and abusing it.
Yep.
So yeah, it's down to which parts of the ecosystem are then blocking that and managing that data.
So there's a couple here which I would say are more in the bar conversations. I've not heard them talked about very openly and seriously, but again, it's the elephant in the room discussion where someone's blaming their competitor. I mean, I can look around this room. Am I allowed to? Obviously, no names can be mentioned in this environment, but it's where. Do you know what happened when I was trying to sell, I don't know, firewall solutions, or when I was trying to sell termination solutions? I found that my termination rates went down when I was doing a demonstration. I was given this data to be able to demonstrate what a good job I was going to do for the enterprise. And I only got a 60% send rate. Why? How is that even possible? And often the finger is then being pointed at their competitor or some other bad actor within this environment. Now, it's always a difficult one to talk about when we're all one big happy community. But I think it is an interesting thing to watch out for. And again, it's one of those, obviously I kind of make a point of this because when I look at validating numbers, making sure they really exist, making sure that they are actually reachable, it's actually very easy to deal with this kind of problem. Don't think because someone has given you a data set and a number of test messages that you've necessarily got a good data set and a good test messages. And we're regularly asked to do kind of a batch validation of quite large data sets, and we'll often be chucking out 20%. And that's quite extraordinary. Now, is that the customer's data? Is that the user's data? Is that because it's a data set which is intended to discover that kind of problem? Who knows? But it's very interesting to see such high reject rates. I don't know if you want to comment, you might not want to.
I think some customers do have just inaccurate data, you know? It either hasn't been recorded correctly when it's recorded by them, or it's just out of date, you know? I think most of those who operate, say, like in the US model, you know, you can use like CNAME and go and check the name against the number, and depending on the country, it's the different services. Yeah, there's ways of trying to understand if you've got the right number and accurate numbers rather than just, is it hit the right format, you know? I think even considering the right format for the country, if you're going internationally, that's quite complex to stay on top of because of the evolution there, as well as the number of changes you were talking about GNR, you know. As an organisation for ourselves, so, you know, we can't do that because it's just too large, it's too scalable. You need trusted parties like yourselves and others who can do that on our behalf.
So there's also, and the next one probably falls into this kind of bad customer data category. I mean, there's one example that we were aware of where a particular application was actually debt collection. So people are being sent messages. Now, oddly enough, when you're going out trying to chase someone for debt collection, often their mobile phone doesn't work anymore. They haven't paid the bill. So there is no way of delivering those messages. So you find the delivery rate can be incredibly low for a specific application for entirely good reason. It's just a characteristic of the data set. So I think that's a very interesting one where it almost comes down to the particular application or the particular environment that data is being used in.
Well, they talk about debt collection. I can see DCB at the back of the room there.
Yeah.
You know, he'll give you a brilliant demo of using RCS and debt collection that's been astounding.
Good.
RCS works brilliantly.
So the last two are kind of strange ones, because I think these are almost, well, you could say accidental or incidental. You could say they're weak design or weak implementation. You know, you've got perfectly good data, but the customer is simply unreachable. It may just be degraded, kind of as I was describing there, just because of the application, just because of the particular environment it's being used in. But you do come on to this last point, and it's perfectly good data, it's a perfectly reachable customer, but just due to the way the networks work, it won't get delivered. And, you know, when we're looking at, well, there's 100 countries that have got number portability today. There's probably 50 of those that are over 30% portability penetration. The rest are around the 10% mark. We've even got a couple which are up in the 50% portability area. Some of those countries have a mobile environment where if you send them a message and you send it to the wrong operator, it falls on the floor. It simply won't be delivered. You will be charged for it. So if they're a 30% country, it's quite simple. You've got a 30% wastage. You are paying for 30% of traffic that's not delivered. So obviously my message, because we sell this data, port correct it first, please. But it astonishes me how many people don't. How many people just expect either the aggregation layer or the hubbing layer or the terminating operator to forward that traffic on, because they're used to that happening in a voice environment, or they're used to it happening with P2P messaging. They don't realise in the A2P world, that's not necessarily the luxury that you're going to get. So do check that out and make that part of your networking implementation.
Do you think that set the groundwork then for AIT?
Well, it sets a place for it to hide. It sets a place where there is an expectation there's going to be an undeliverable data set. And if that number is 30%, you can hide an awful lot in 30%. It also sets an expectation that, yeah, you are going to pay for things that don't get delivered. But it doesn't have to be that way. If you actually do route directly to the right destination and you get your routing right and you use good data to make that happen, because again, there's different grades of quality of data. They might be weeks old, they might be months old, they might be cached data. If you have live data that's telling you where that number's ported to, you'll get better delivery rates. It's almost as simple as that, straight return on investment.
Sorry, just going back to that last point. I think that it's not... I agree you should do the porting because that really tells you if it is handset on there, but it doesn't always work exactly like that.
Right.
You know, there are scenarios where Interconnect will work in some scenarios and not in others to the same destination, where there are controls based on sender ID or content because of the way the firewalls work. So I could send one message to a handset to the wrong operator and it'll get there. The next one I send, because it's a specific brand on the sender ID or specific content, it won't get to the handset via the interconnect. So absolutely doing the lookup in advance is critical to make sure
So
you
that's
hit
kind
the
of
network
missing
straight
off
away.
this list. I'll have to add that onto the list because I think that's a really good point where you're really looking at the message acceptance rules. It's not just routing, it's acceptance of that message, which might be a variable that you need to take account of upfront, not back end.
Yeah.
So I kind of tried to sort of summarize some of these points about who is the bad actor. I don't really like this phrase, bad actor. I can't think of a better way of describing the bad boys, but anyway, let's carry on calling them bad actors. An awful lot of this is about trusting the players, knowing who you're giving data to, knowing who you've got data from, understanding the characteristics of where it came from, understanding the characteristics of where it's going to. And I think all of those are points which hopefully we all know and love. But I think it is kind of just raising that a little bit up of our priority list to make sure we're not just send and forget. Send and forget is not good enough when you're trying to provide a business service. It's trying to up that quality and that understanding of really what is happening there.
So when you say trust, where are you saying is that trust aimed? Because from a brand perspective, if they're working with an aggregator, then it's ultimately that trust. But I guess the question that has popped up several times already, yesterday and today, is what's going to be the impact of AIT on the industry? So ultimately, will it also mean, here's something that Rami questioned earlier, is what's AIT impact going to have on enterprise? Mm-hmm. So ultimately, I think it comes down to what the consumer does with messaging. Because if the consumer stops trusting messaging, and they stop opening it and looking at it, then enterprises will stop using it. So it's simple as that. So if that trust starts to kind of permeate its way down into the actual device with the user, then I think as an industry, that's where we've got the problem. So at the moment, I think where, the trust between, I guess, an enterprise and an aggregator is still there, pretty much 90, 100% of the time. But I just think ultimately it's that when it gets down to the user, that's where we've got the real issue. And when that happens, I think that's when an enterprise will start to question where they spend their money.
Yeah. Now, I'd like to kind of open it up to some questions. I've almost got a question for both us and for the audience in that, I think we've heard a few things spoken about today. What are the proposals? What do we think about interrupting the money flow? Does that work? What do we think about registration mechanisms, registration of campaigns, of users? What do we think about codes of conduct? I think you'll find there's two of us up here who are very, very keen on the principle of having agreed codes of conduct about how this operates, a major part of the MEF's proposition. And obviously a lot of what I've talked about, I've kind of woven it into the conversation, is the technical measures that can be taken. So those are the kind of things I'm thinking about, but I see a question already, so please.
Hi, Yolanda Serena from Twilio here. I wanted to ask you, don't you think that MNOs has a key role on this? I mean, given that the fact that generated traffic and all fraud has grown a lot in the countries where the price is high, where there are exclusivities, maybe I said the sector, the organizations involved in the sector like MEF or GSMA should encourage them to remove exclusivities, to work, to be more transparent, to work with some hubs, at least 4 or 5, to publish their pricing. And I don't know, don't you think that this should solve a lot of things and work with independent filtering companies like that is we have here? What do you think about that?
Jason, do you want to respond?
Yeah, I think, MEF's trying to do some of that work. I think, it's up to all of us to try and bring those operators to the table and discuss those things. I think doing events like this. You know, this year in Dublin, last year was Amsterdam, the same event. There's another one in Stockholm in May, I think it is. May, June, I've forgotten now. Thank you. May the 31st. Sales pitch. And at those events, I think it's bringing the local operators into those events so they can learn and understand what our thoughts are. But in terms of trying to remove some of those exclusivities, I think there's both sides of the coin. You know, it works for the operators because they don't have to worry about the investment and those things in some cases. It's where do they think the right price is for delivering those services? You know, if they're putting an exclusivity in and then quadrupling the price, that's unreasonable to those businesses, and so those businesses maybe are less likely to use messaging. So yeah, it's getting the debate going, I think, more than anything else.
I think from picking it up, many operators don't know actually what their routes are being sold for. Okay.
Good point.
Which is a different problem altogether. But I think Yolanda has a great idea. We can have the manufacturer's suggested price, and it'll be published every year. One of the reasons why there's no problem with pricing in WhatsApp is that everybody knows the price of WhatsApp. It's on the internet. Can't play around with the price. You can sell a subscription package to make some margin, but the price of delivering that WhatsApp message is well known. What would happen if the operators would publish a manufacturer's suggested price?
So, well, let's ask the room. You know, if we said, I don't know, it doesn't matter what the country is, if there was a set price for a country, who would be in favour of it? If you put your arms up for those people to be in favour for a openly published price.
You've got to put your hand up.
So 25% of the room, probably. But a little bit more, third. So, yeah. Yeah.
So I find that really interesting that wasn't around interrupting the money flow. It's actually about making the money flow transparent. Correct. Which is a totally different approach to this.
But that's then bringing accountability
Exactly.
to the spend.
Exactly. Another question.
Eileen from Puka here. Just to mention that there are published interconnect rates, certainly in Ireland and I think in the UK as well. So there is quite a lot of price transparency in the industry. I think perhaps speaking as a smaller independent aggregator and software provider, I would be quite against there being just a very limited number of aggregators plugged into the mobile operators, because I think in every country, I think it benefits the industry as a whole to have an ecosystem where people are, working with enterprise to build use cases and to build applications and to bring innovation to the industry. So just kind of consolidating that into a small number of aggregators, I don't think would be good for the industry, personally.
I agree. I think keeping it open for lots of people to have connectivity is the right thing to do. I think the interconnect rates, they are open, but it's more the A2P closed door on-net rates, which are the ones that are more hidden generally from public view. At the moment, anyway.
I hope we're all right for time, because I know we're right on there. Asking forgiveness. Please.
Yeah, hey guys. I just wanted to turn back on the comment that Ira said about the published price lists as well on WhatsApp side, and the idea that we can actually make margin on top of them as well. There is one example that we practically deal with in Scandinavia, where Telenor in Norway publishes their rate on their website publicly for everyone. It's kind of the flat rate for most aggregators as well. And it's actually a pretty cool tool to use with enterprises, because you can go, this is the operator rate, this is published on their website, this is the margin that I'm putting on top, and I say 20, 25% on top. No enterprise really has a problem with you having a 20, 25% margin, because they know we need to do business as well, right? Otherwise, go connect yourself. So you do your margin on top, there's the price, and if anybody goes below that price, then the question I get to ask is quite easy, is how are they getting that? You see, the operator themselves says this is the price. How are they making that? So you can actually add trust by having that transparency in place, going, hey, yeah, my margin's that. That's the price. I'm selling to you at that. You know how much money I'm making. You know how the business is working. It's quite easy. And if anybody goes below that rate, you pretty much immediately get to point out what are you risking for them to make that money. So that transparency has helped, especially on the enterprise side, quite a lot, and just experience in that particular market, explaining the business to them, making it a little bit easier to also counter anybody poaching your client.
Good. Great. So I think it is time I drew this to a close, and obviously I have to thank my panellists very much. I didn't give Nick much of a time, but he got lots of time earlier on, so he's all right.
Just the eye candy.
Yeah, it's just the eye candy, absolutely. And I obviously must thank you as the audience, very much appreciate, and online and here in the room, and also the MEF. I think this has been a superb event.
Just one last thing, I'd like to thank the people on stage.
Thank you.
Jason Lunn and Tim in particular, and well, you, Nick, as well. You're very active in the... And I was coming back to just in particular...
Thank you.
But this guy, I'm sorry, in particular, you've got to have favourites, because this guy was involved in putting together our original business SMS code of conduct. So the Future of Messaging programme has been around 7 years. We've got 120, 130 members, but unfortunately only about 40% of you have signed up to the Code of Conduct. So there's plenty of work to be done on that. But thank you very much, Jason. Thank you, Tim.
Thank you all very much.
Thanks, Nick.
Thank you.